this computer. Okay.
So maybe the best thing for me to do is to share my screen. So let me find the actual issue. So we're going to discuss the PowerShell Core support for the Docker Windows Executor. Before we get started reviewing that part, like what I wanted to explain is what is PowerShell Core and like why do we need it? So we already have support for PowerShell. And what's usually the Windows community mean by saying PowerShell? It usually means PowerShell 5. PowerShell 5 is only runs on Windows, and it's the shell for Windows. But PowerShell Core was actually PowerShell 6 in this sense, so the next iteration after PowerShell 5, and it was open sourced, and it also was made cross-platform compatible, meaning PowerShell Core can run on Linux, can run on Mac, and can run on Windows as well. So you might hear people say either PowerShell or PowerShell Core. When they usually mean PowerShell Core, they usually mean PowerShell 6 or 7, which is the cross-compatible one. And you can also see people writing it PWSH, so like this one. That is because that is the name of the binary that you invoke to invoke the shell. So for example, if I open up on my Mac, close Slack. If I write PWSH, I'm actually invoking a PowerShell 7.3. And it works pretty much the same as PowerShell. So for example, it's a bit different than Bash. The difference between PowerShell and Bash are out of the scope, but basically most of the things are objects instead of text, like Bash. There's still piping involved and things like that, but the way you filter through things are through objects instead of like doing a grep or a set or an awk, for example. So recently, maybe 3 to 4 releases, we added support for PWSH, so PowerShell Core, for the shell executor. So if I go to open up my GitLab runner config, and go to my shell executor, this one. If I do PWSH, it's gonna start generating PowerShell core scripts to run my job. So let's just run a simple echo hello world job. Runner. And this is behind the scenes generating PowerShell core scripts instead of Bash scripts. Now the benefits of this is for Like for example, for customers who are running both on Windows and on Mac or on Linux, instead of having them generate one job in Bash and another job in PowerShell Core, for example, they can just use PowerShell Core and it's going to run cross-platform. So that's the benefit of that. Now,
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
yeah. Now that we added support for PowerShell Core for the shell executor, that opens up all the other executors. So we need to add support for the Docker executor, the Kubernetes executor. The others are supported already. So like Parallels, Custom Executor, and VirtualBox. And the reason that Docker and Kubernetes aren't is because these scripts actually, some of them run on the user container. So when the user defines the image keyword, some of the scripts run on that image. But for example, for the Git cloning and for the cache upload and download and artifact upload and download, they run on a separate image called the helper image, which is our own image where we have our own dependencies and things like that. So this makes it a bit easier for the user. Instead of having to install Git in his image, they don't have to think about that. Now, since we're generating PowerShell scripts, PowerShell core scripts, we need to have PowerShell core installed in our helper image so we can actually run them, right? And the reason we're doing this somewhat of a simplistic way of like, if I'm using PowerShell core for the user script, I'm using PowerShell core for the helper script, it's mostly for simplicity reasons. Like if we just have a job running and generating multiple shells, that's going to be confusing to debug and like even to keep track. Like this one should be run in this shell, this one should be run in this shell. So we try to follow the methodology of this job is running this shell every step in the way. So we need to actually add support to PowerShell core to our helper image. And the first one we're going to start with is the Docker Windows. So as we might know, Docker runs natively on Windows, and we do have support for that. We just need to add PowerShell core to it. We have some documentation on how to develop on Windows for a non-Windows environment. So the documentation is here. Basically, after you read this, you realize that we have the runner code base. We have a vagrant file that does everything for us. So if we go to vagrant file, we have a file that creates two kinds of machines. So one of them is Windows Server and another one is Windows 10. The difference between them is Windows 10 is actual Windows 10, so you can log in and see the UI if you prefer the UI, and Windows Server, you just get a shell and that's it. By default, we use the Windows Server just because it's a bit less resource hungry. It uses a bit less memory, and even disk size is a bit, it's a lot smaller since it doesn't have the GUI stuff.
So does this use underlying as a virtualization? Does this use like VirtualBox or VMware?
Yeah, this uses VirtualBox by default. I don't, as far as we only provide VirtualBox configuration. We don't provide anything else. I know, for example, Tomas, who runs on Linux, does not use this one. He has his own libvirt configuration for Windows, if I'm not mistaken. But like this is the default and documented and supported way of running Windows for development. So it's just a matter of running Vagrant up. Now, the first time you run it, it's gonna take a really, really long time. So because it has to download like a 5 gigabyte image from the internet, and then it has to provision the machine itself. Provisioning the machine is installing a bunch of like the correct Go version, the correct Git version, and so on and so forth. And then it's doing some Windows updates, some rebootings, and things like that. So the first time you run it is going to take a while. Now, let's wait for it to finish. And I'm gonna go turn on the lights because it's getting dark in here. Give me 1 second.
Yeah, I was just looking in parallel at the box you're using for Vagrant. It looks like it supports VMware, which I'm particularly interested in because I'm using VMware Lovely. Just for the record.
So now there are two ways to access the VM. We actually install an OpenSSH server on the machine itself, so we can run Vagrant SSH and do SSH in the box. But that sometimes works, sometimes doesn't, just because OpenSSH is a bit finicky on Windows. So what I usually do is use Windows RDP. So I just have an RDP program. The one I prefer on macOS is Trial TSX, just because it's like the Microsoft one that's provided on Mac had some bugs that were a bit annoying for me. So I just use this one. And then it's a matter of providing the correct credentials. So localhost, because Vagrant does port forwarding, and 3389, because we look here, this one, Windows Server 3389. And this one is for the SSH server. So I'm gonna.
Do you know what the two other ports are?
These are WinRM, if I'm not mistaken. So WinRM is a technology from Microsoft, which is very, very similar to SSH, where it provides you endpoints to run scripts over the internet. We actually use WinRM for GitLab.com shared runners on Windows to actually execute the scripts. So basically, it's OpenSSH bot for Windows, basically.
Sounds like it could be remote management.
Yeah, yeah. So we have PowerShell installed on this one as well. So I usually just like to start a new window. And it is, we have an environment variable runner src, and that leads me to C GitLab runner, and that is where I have the runner code base. Now, this is network mounted, so as soon as I do a change locally, for example, let's do get contents on the version, right? Right now it's pointing to 13.6. And if I go here and do an update on the version, it should reflect automatically here. So the way I usually do it is I still keep my editor, still develop on my own system, but then when I do compilation or when I do some changes, I run them on my Linux machine.
So which file sharing is it using? Is it like just VirtualBox shell folders, or is it using like SMB or something like that?
It's using VirtualBox shared folders. And that is completely abstracted from us, to be honest. We just have, where is it?
Yeah, the
This one,
sync folder.
Yeah, sync folder. So we're just telling it, hey, sync the current directly to the C GitLab runner. It's using, so if we open up VirtualBox, we can actually look at the settings, and it is a shared folder. So if we go to shared folders, here we have the definition of the shared folder. So it's taking the location of GitLab runner and assigning it to a C colon GitLab runner. And yep. So that is how you start the VirtualBox machine, and things like that. And then what I usually do. So let's run a job, right? So let me remove this change. Now, since this is on a shared network drive with VirtualBox, compiling on the VirtualBox machine itself is very, very slow. It takes a minute to compile the GitLab runner. So what I usually do is I do make runner bin here, and then specify a build platform, Windows AMD 64, and it will move it to a directory called output binaries GitLab runner, and then the OS and the ARC. So I compile it on my Mac just because it's a lot faster and has more resources, and the disk is a lot faster than a shared disk. And then after this is compiled, I can execute it from VM. So that is in out, binaries, GitLab runner, Windows. Now we support two types of Windows, the 32-bit Windows, which is the 386, and the AMD 64, which is the 64-bit Windows. And then I'm just going to specify the config.toml that I have in the root directory of the GitLab runner.
Do people still run like 32-bit versions of Windows? Like which version would that be?
There is still a 32-bit version of Windows, even for Windows 10, if I'm not mistaken. Even for Windows 7. And you would be surprised the amount of people that are still using Windows 7. Like I don't know, I don't have a hard number, but I still like see issues coming in. Hey, I'm running Windows 7 and the runner does not work or something like that. So yeah, it is crazy. And that is mostly for people using the shell runner to compile Windows desktop applications and things like that. So it's a safe that GitLab runner is being used that way, but I mean, if it works for people, I don't think we should break it until we have a very good reason to. So I have a runner called Docker Windows that's using the Docker Windows Executor. Now, on Linux, we usually have Linux we usually have Executor plus Docker, right? But since there are some differences between the Docker on Windows and Docker on Linux, we said, hey, let's be very, very explicit which Docker you're using. And the difference between this is the biggest one is the paths. So for example, it uses the drive letters and things like that. The helper image is different. And also one idiosyncrasy of Windows is the host OS. So the OS that is running the Windows container needs to be the same version as the container OS. So if I'm running Windows 1809, the only containers that I can run are that are based on Windows 1809. I cannot run on Windows 1903 or 1909. That's why we have this problem where we have to build and deploy a helper image for each Windows version we support, just because that's how Windows work. And that is strictly because they're sharing the kernels and so on and so forth. So yeah, that is like the biggest gotcha there. You see some configuration here. These are the default ones. Like there aren't such things as privileged containers of Windows. There is no such thing as Docker and Docker on Windows. And yeah, and things like that. So I also like to do pull policy if not present for Windows explicitly there, instead of using always, just because Windows containers are usually like 5 gigabytes large. So pulling 5 gigabytes, it's not always going to pull it because then Docker is smart enough to use the cache on disk and so on and so forth, right? But it still has to verify 5 gigabytes of checksums and things like that. So that's still very, very slow. I just do if not present. And the Windows machine itself, luckily, comes with some Docker images pre-code. So if we do Docker images here, we can see that we have the 18091 one created. Now, for this merge request, so let's open up the merge request. We are actually updating the helper image. So we need to build the helper image on our local machine to so we can actually use it for our jobs. So before we do that, let's run a simple job, right? So our binary is GitLab runner. And that started the runner. Now we go to run a job. We should see it using the vagrant one. This is using the shell executor. I just need to swap that. A virtualized environment, unfortunately. Developing on Windows through like a machine on GCP or something like that.
If I just lost audio for the past 2 or 3 minutes. Sorry, my headphones ran out of battery.
Ah, no worries.
Could you just like rewind just a bit?
Sure. Yeah, I was just saying that I'm gonna run a job on the Windows Docker executor, but then I realized I'm using the shell executor on Windows, so it's wrote them right.
Okay.
What I was going to say is things are a lot slower on Windows just because we're running on virtualized environments. And I was saying that I never actually tried running on a cloud provider to see if that improves development speed, but yeah. Now, this is something from how our helper image work, right? So since we're using an image for our job, we use specific naming conventions. So one release of the runner is using one version of the runner helper image, and the future releases use a different one, right? So we can keep one-to-one relationship between the helper image and the runner version. So if we release a new command or remove a flag or do whatever, we can use the correct versions. So since I compile it, I'm expecting this version, but I obviously don't have it. So just for the demo purposes, I'm just gonna do this. So I'm gonna look at helper images I have compiled, hopefully. And I have the latest one. So I'm just gonna go to my config.toml file and just update latest here. So you can actually overwrite the name of the helper image. So this is very, very useful for some customers who have their own helper image for compliance reasons. For example, each Docker container needs to be based off one image, for example, or they need to have specific tools and things like that. So they can overwrite the helper image, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of why we have versioned images, but that's a discussion for another time. So we have that, and if we restart it, it should work. Is there any questions so far?
No, I think that's all pretty clear.
Awesome. Now looking at the merge request itself, so we need to do a few things, right? So from what we know right now, we're already generating PowerShell's core scripts, so we do not need to touch that. What we need to do is add PowerShell core to our helper image. So this is what Pedro did on this part. And this part, and like doing the checksum checks and things like that. So with that, it's also, give me a second, I'm trying to find it. Yeah, this part here. Now that we actually have support for PowerShell Core, we need to actually execute PowerShell Core in our helper image when PowerShell Core is configured, right? So since on Windows we always had support for PowerShell, we kind of hard-coded the commands that the helper image executes on start, right? So before it used to execute this one, just run PowerShell and then with these commands, right? So don't load any profiles, so on and so forth, and then pass the minus command and the minus. So then we can direct standard in and over the internet with the Docker client, and then it will give us standard out. So basically we have to do the same thing, but instead of executing PowerShell, we have to execute PowerShell Core, for example. So I'm guessing this is what he did here with the CFG shell. So instead of using PowerShell, it's using PWSH. So one comment I have about this, like one thing I would check is, where is this CFG.shell coming from? Is it like from the config file itself or from someone else? Because this can be like whatever, right? Like would this cause any problems, for example? But luckily, PowerShell 5 and PowerShell Core, I would say 99% of the cases they're backwards compatible. So as you can see here, we didn't change any of these flags just because these flags work on both PowerShell 5 and PowerShell Core. So we're good on that front. I also saw a mention for nano server. I'm not sure what this means yet, but basically there are two types of Windows servers in the Windows ecosystem. There is the server core. Well, there's more stuff, but the two main ones are the server core one, which is the Windows Server edition, but with the core compatible components enabled only. So as you can see, you just see the shell and nothing else, and then you just have you don't have any GUI whatsoever. And then there's the one with server core but with GUI, so that's a bit bigger and things like that. But we don't need the GUI for containers, so we don't use that one. And then there's also Nano Core. The way I like Nano Server, sorry. The way I like to think of Nano Server is like the difference between Alpine Server and Ubuntu, right? So Alpine Server is like bare minimum to get the Linux kernel running. And this is the same thing with Nano Server. It's the bare minimum to get Windows Server running. Now, we never really supported Nano Server just because we never supported PowerShell Core, because Nano Server is so slim, it never had PowerShell 5 in it. It only had PowerShell Core. So I'm not sure if this automatically adds Nano Server support, but that is something that we need to check. I would say, yeah, that means that it does support Nano Server, but we still need to check that. One other thing that I forgot to mention is that you can see that we only updated one Docker file. The reason for this is we use the same Docker file for all the Windows versions. And we just use the argument here to specify what is the base image. The benefit of this is just dry up our code, right? So we just have one Docker file for Windows, and then it can fan out to all the Windows versions. So keep in mind when you review this, like, okay, are these changes gonna work for the Windows 1903 image, for the 1909, for the 2004, and for the 1809? So that's something that probably when I'm reviewing this, I'm gonna take a look at. So let's see if this ran, and it ran successfully. Hooray. Now, for us to build the helper image, we have a PowerShell script to do this. So build release Windows images. And this is just one PowerShell script that does everything. It documents all the fields that are available. So you need to specify the Windows versions. So we use the base image, the Git version build, the checksums, the LFS. If it's the latest one or not, this is only used for when we tag the helper image and things like that. The Docker Hub username and password and things like that are when we want to push to Docker Hub. So for development, you will mostly be using these ones, not this latest, these ones. And there's also one field that is not documented. I actually have a merge request open, is to skip cleanup. So the way this works is it builds the image, it releases the image, and then deletes the image. And this is mostly for historical reasons. Before, we just used to have one machine running Windows builds, and like it wasn't cleaning up after ourselves. So like literally after 2 hours, it was running out of disk space just because, yeah, Docker images take a lot of disk space. So this one just deletes it after it's done. So The way you define environment variables on PowerShell is a bit different than Bash, so we'll go through that together. So it's using a command called setItem value env. So let's start with Windows version. And no, 2. So setItem, it's key. No, it's path. Yes, it's path env Windows version. And then value server core 1809. If you're ever confused by these, like what values they need to be, they are actually all defined in our GitLab CI/YAML file. So we go to the release stage here and look at Windows version. There we go. So like the Windows version, server core 1903, 1809, and so on and so forth. Now in the future, this might change. We might actually change the helper image to use nano server instead of server core, just so instead of like 5 gigabytes per container, we have a 1 gigabyte per container, which will be a bit faster on Windows, just because Windows does not have overlay, so it does not have all the caching mechanisms that overlay brings. And that is something that we need to think about in this merge request. Since we're adding more stuff to the helper image, by how much is it going to increase our Windows image size and things like that? So that is something to keep in mind. And like, if it's going to increase it by a lot, should we maybe migrate to nano server and always use nano server if PowerShell Core is being enabled? That is something I'll leave a comment in the merge request, because that is quite of an interesting idea to have just nano server for PowerShell Core, so it's a bit faster. But anyways, so we defined this one. So if we do just an echo env Windows version, we got server core. Keep in mind, environment variables on Windows are appended with this env : stuff. There are ones that aren't there, but without env, but those are usually system defined. So all user environment variables are done with the env. So setItem path env. What's the next one? Let's see. Git version. This is the one we set. Here, 2.27. And I see that we're already updated on this one as well. So git version build. And that is one. I usually just copy paste them from our CI/YAML file.
That's a lot of manual steps just to be
It
able
is.
to build the image. Is there a way to like automate that?
When I was doing the script, I was toying with the idea of maybe we have default values. So like, for example, 2.27, 2.1, and this one as the default value. And then they're overwritten by GitLab CI YAML file. But what me and Thomas were afraid with was that if we want to update the Git version, we have to go to two places, right? Upgrade the GitLab CI YAML file and the script. And we wanted to keep our GitLab CI YAML file as the single source of truth, just because it's a bit more declarative in that sense. But like maybe if you open up a merge request to define these default values, maybe it's not a bad idea to do so, because yes, it says a lot of manual steps.
I guess it's not easy to like parse YAML in PowerShell to get those values from the GitLab CI.YAML.
That is an interesting idea. I never tried that, to be honest, so I can't really say.
Well, if I get frustrated with this, I'll probably try something.
Do it, because it is a bit frustrating. But these are usually kind of the first time set it and forget it kind of thing. But yeah, like if you can improve it, do so. So what other fields do we have to set? The LFS version. I think it's that version that we're using. Let me check. Now if we do scripts, is that under scripts? It's under CI, but okay. Now if we execute it, it should start building it. Aha, this is the same problem Pedro was having on his computer. When I tried it, it didn't fail, but there's something wrong with VirtualBox, with the new version of VirtualBox. It's not appending things correctly. So let me fix it really quickly. No, it wasn't this one. Let me see.
It's the one on the top. Docker files, image-based path, maybe?
Yeah. No.
Nope.
What is context in this case?
I think it's the build context.
Yeah, build context. So this should be the case. Yeah, copy item out binaries. Okay, let's see, because he did open up a merge request once, but it think he closed it because it worked on mine. Okay, let's see. So apparently 7/4/ works, but the cat separator on Windows /1. I'm not sure why this works. Okay, let's see if it works or not. Nope. Okay. Do you want to debug this together, or do you want me to fix it later on?
I'm actually just looking at a Slack thread. It seems like there's like an incident with the labels MR that was deployed yesterday. So I'm just reading through what's going on.
Oh, which one is this? So the labels on Docker machine. You're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, it's. I think some of the instances that we added labels to don't have permissions to set labels when the machines are created.
Oh.
Seems like Thomas has reverted the merge and is applying the revert. Just gonna pause the recording for a second.